Wow, that's really bright. So, good afternoon. When I was about your age, I got called into my guidance counselor's office in high school. And I don't really remember very much about our meeting for the most part. I remember that her name was fortuitous. Her name was Miss Wise. And her entire office was decorated in Wizard of Oz themed paraphernalia. It was everywhere. And she sat me down and she very sincerely asked me, "Ryan, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" I sat there, my 16-year-old self, thinking pretty hard about it, and I answered very honestly, "I have no idea." And then she was like, "Well, Ryan, think about what skills you're really good at. What are you really good at, Ryan?" And once again, I answered very honestly, napping. I am an exceptional napper. I nap in any situation at all. And Miss Wise just shook her head and said, "Ryan, napping is not a recognized Olympic sport at this time. You're going to need to pick another profession." And so I thought a little bit harder about it, and I was like, well, how about engineering? My father's an engineer. And I think she could tell from the tone of my voice that I wasn't very excited about engineering. So she was like, "Well, think about it this way. What would you do if you had to take money out of it? If money wasn't an issue, what would you do?" And once again, I answered her very honestly that I had no idea. But that question stayed with me for a very long time. So, when I went to college, I double majored in theater and English, which are the two majors you should select if you're taking money out of the question. And I grew very passionate about English and theater. They were the excellent choices for me, and I knew that I was doing what I wanted. I was excelling in my field. And I continued studying. I got my master's and I got a PhD in English. And while I was working with students, I knew that I had probably picked the right career because I discovered that professors nap all the time. So I was already doing exactly what I should be doing. After I bounced around to a lot of different universities, I ended up at the University of Michigan Shanghai Jiaotong Joint Institute right here in Shanghai. And I knew that I'd found a place that was special. That was way back in 2014. And I was really enjoying working with the students there, and I was really enjoying talking about creative writing, talking about literature, talking about academic writing, but I kept looking at the gates of SJTU, and I knew that there was a bigger world out there. I knew that more people needed help with their writing, and I didn't know exactly how to help them yet. So I did what I thought was the most logical thing to do, and I started a for-profit school. Now, my for-profit school, I decided, was going to be wildly different than anything else that was out there. It was going to be filled with qualified instructors. It was going to have some of the best curriculum around. It was going to have an excellent service to where it stayed with writers for a while. And I worked really hard. I tried to talk to various teachers that I thought could help me out. I looked at prospective office space. I tried to put together a curriculum that I thought was going to be really good because I was determined to change education in China. Except I didn't. I failed horrifically. I did not recruit a single student. And I learned pretty quickly that while I'm a very good English professor, I knew absolutely nothing about running a school. And I didn't know anything about recruiting students either. I talked to every single group of students that was interested in talking to me, and I talked to several groups of students that were not interested in talking to me, and I could not recruit a single one of them to take some creative writing courses. And I realized that now when I look back, it seems like that was probably the right conclusion for it all. I was an unknown guy talking about an unfamiliar subject in a city that I didn't understand yet. And maybe that was what should have happened. And that's when I started Inkwell. After my failure, I kind of took a big, long, deep breath, and I took the official account that I had started from my school and I rebranded it as Inkwell. Inkwell was a nonprofit creative writing group that I had started a year earlier. And when I started Inkwell, I hadn't meant to start anything. It was a nothing, really. It was just me as a creative writing professor wanting to find other writers just to hang out with. Writers like community. And I just, every single weekend, I would post on my official WeChat that I was a writing professor here in Shanghai, and I was willing to meet with any writer at all at a bar and swap work with them. And I would give them feedback if they would give me feedback. And I would work with anybody. And I thought that was going to work. And at first, it didn't at all. I got nobody initially, and my quest to find writing friends had produced no friends. But eventually, I got 2 writers to show up to my meeting, and I had 2 writers who were excellent candidates to start talking about writing, and there was one very drunk girl at our first meeting who may or may not have been a writer, but she was definitely a part of the group that first meeting. And that was it. I had started something. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't elegant, but I had started something. And from there, it grew. More and more people started to join. And writers started inviting their friends. And people started telling me, Ryan, you're pretty good at this whole teaching writing thing. And I was like, thanks, I've only dedicated my life to it. I'm glad I'm okay. And from there, we started developing Inkwell into what it is today. Now, I learned very early on that Inkwell didn't need to be something super fancy. That when I thought about what Inkwell was and I thought about everything that my school was going to be, I realized that Inkwell was doing it all and it was doing it for free. I didn't have to charge reasonable tuition at my school. I just wasn't going to have tuition. And I didn't need fancy classrooms. Any place with a table could serve as a classroom. And as a result, Inkwell was mostly held in a series of bars. And for the first few years that Inkwell was around, we were just a couple of dozen people that were working in different places, sharing their work and developing as writers. And now, every single week, there are hundreds and hundreds of writers across China that are swapping their work at bars. So, this is what my guidance counselor had been getting at. This is what happens when you take money out of the equation. When you take money out of the equation, the only thing left to focus on is the thing itself. If we weren't worrying about what it all meant, then what it all meant and how much it was worth, then we could just focus on writing, and we could just get a whole bunch of writers together, and we could focus on writing itself. And for me, I think the biggest piece of advice that I could give you about working inside of a nonprofit is that nonprofits are an opportunity to develop real skills right now. Because when I started working with Inkwell, I started developing a set of skills that I didn't have yet and I didn't even know that I needed yet. I had to learn to start selling things because I couldn't sell anything to anyone yet. I had to start selling free creative writing courses, which I didn't know you had to sell, but I found out you do need to sell people a little bit on it, because in Shanghai, the more expensive something is, the more valuable people think it is. And when I was talking to parents and I was like, yes, it's free, they were like, oh, that must mean it's terrible. And that was a constant uphill battle for me. But before I knew it, I was developing some really useful skills. And when I took over as the director of writing for my college at SJTU, I realized I had a set of skills that helped me succeed as the director. I knew how to recruit people into my organization. I knew how to situate them into their roles. I got comfortable developing a vision for my program and leading people to get there. And I realized that these are the sort of soft skills that you need in order to succeed. These are the sort of skills that in this undetermined world of ours help you in any field. They help give shape to your determination. And then from there, I started to kind of think about the greater vision of Inkwell. All of a sudden, we had hundreds of writers all over China. We're in multiple cities now across China and across Asia at this point. And I started to ask myself, why am I doing this? And for me, that required rethinking what I meant when I talked about education. We had to rethink the way that education was discussed, because so often we have a particular feeling about how education should be experienced and evaluated. And Inkwell was going to do it differently. Inkwell was going to stay with people over time, and it was going to be a lasting contract between us and our writers, and we were going to do it all for free. But why did I still kept staying involved with Inkwell is that I realized that I wasn't just helping the public, I was also helping myself. Because when you think about it, writing a book is kind of a crazy idea. Without anybody asking you, you develop an idea for a book. Then you decide to spend hundreds of hours brainstorming, outlining, and writing this book. Then you try to sell it to the general public. And that's a whole lot of faith in what you're putting together without it ever going to market. And having my writing organization really helped me develop my books. Because when I started Inkwell 10 years ago, I didn't have a single book. And then over, 6 years later, I signed my first contract for 3 fantasy books that came out earlier this year. And Inkwell helped me realize that I was investing in my writing skills when nobody else was asking me to. And so that way, when I had the opportunity to write the books, I had books to give. Now, some people think that this is kind of sheer luck, but I would say that luck is just opportunity meeting preparation. And I was prepared because I'd been writing, and I'd been writing because of my nonprofit group. Because inside of a nonprofit, you're able to develop skills right now while other people say that they're waiting for opportunities. Because if there's one thing that working with nonprofits for 10 years has taught me, it's that the best time to start something is always yesterday. So I realized that education didn't have to be so complicated. I've taught at SJTU, I've taught at a lot of different universities in China over my 10 years here, and I realized that education didn't need to be overly complicated. A lot of the time, education, we get distracted by the sparkly lights of technology. We talk about online portals, we talk about smart classrooms, we talk about applications and tablets and all sorts of things. I hear about it every day at work. But working in nonprofit education, when you have zero resources, you realize that education doesn't have to be super complicated. It takes one dedicated teacher and a small class of students, and that's the way that you get started. And from there, that's where Inkwell developed Pulse. Pulse was a high school initiative that we put together to start trying to help writers in the high school level develop their writing skills. We started really simple, with just a handful of students that we had inside of Inkwell, because there's a lot of teachers already in Inkwell, and we developed a system of mutual support. So that way, students could work with each other and develop their own writing skills. And that way, slowly, over the course of a year or two, students could find their own voices as writers and develop real-world editorial and writing skills. And yes, this program it's not nearly what it should be, but it's an excellent first step in developing free creative writing education. So, how does it start? For me, working with nonprofits, I think it always starts with a challenging question and a logical answer. And for me, that challenging question was, how do I spread the goodwill of creative writing inside of China? Because when I got here 10 years ago, I couldn't find a literature community that was really active. And when I talked to students, parents, and school administrators, there was real skepticism about what could be done and what students were capable of. And that's when I decided to get to work. I started Inkwell so that way writers would be followed over years. We didn't see students as a product of a 10-class sequence. We didn't see the relationship as ending. People work on writing for their entire lives in order to get it right. And you can't see writing as a short-term investment. So as a result, Inkwell made the decision to just stay there with writers. And for me, most problems, like my problem, are not amazingly complicated. They just require someone to care. Someone who's willing to donate a little bit of time and somebody to take responsibility for the problem. Because worthy problems that have logical solutions will find their support if they keep going long enough. So, to kind of cap out, I definitely want to encourage you to get involved in nonprofits. I think it's a great place to be developing your skills that will be useful later on. And it's okay, it has to start somewhere. This is the first writing retreat that I ever ran with random writers across China, and this one only had, I think, 14 writers, and the last one I held had 60. It's every single time we do something, it gets a little bit bigger. But to try to illustrate this point, I'll tell you a story I heard not too long ago. It's about the Stanford MBA program. In the Stanford MBA program, students have to take, in their first year, a class called entrepreneurship. And in entrepreneurship, they're divided into classes, they're divided into groups, and each group is given $50. And they're given 1 week to make as much money as possible. Now, some groups chose to start a used book buyback program, some students developed a bicycle repair shop, some students did a car wash, but the group that was the most successful developed a restaurant reservation system. Not a fancy system, but just a system where members of the company would get tickets at busy restaurants and then sell them to freshly coming diners to allow them to move up in the queue. This was an answer to the problem that didn't require any money at all. The other groups often saw the $50 as a filter that they had to filter their ideas through, that there was a limitation because of the amount of money that they had been given to start something. But the restaurant reservation group realized that if you had a good problem and you had a simple solution, there was always something to be done there. And nonprofit groups just take this to another level. Nonprofit groups ignore the $50 altogether and they ask you a very simple question. What is it that you want to improve around you? There's nothing stopping you from working on it. Nothing. You don't even need the $50. And yes, you might stumble, you might fail, but that's okay. Those moments I like to think of the playwright Samuel Beckett, and I'll paraphrase him a little bit when he said, try, fail better. It's a slow process, but that moment of hesitation, that moment of failure, that's when you're learning something with your nonprofit. Thank you so much.